Right now, the percentage of Bitcoin supply in profit is about 74.3%, making the supply in loss approximately 25.7%. So essentially, 25% of the amount of Bitcoin that people have been buying is currently sitting at a loss from where their entry was. Of course, 74% is sitting in profit.
Bitcoin has always moved in cycles. While every cycle looks different on the surface, many of the underlying mechanics repeat with remarkable consistency. Historically, major Bitcoin lows tend to form roughly every 4 years, often aligning with midterm years or the period just before a new halving cycle begins. Going back to 2011, 2014, 2015, 2018, 2020, and 2022, Bitcoin consistently reset after long expansions. These resets didn't always happen because of panic selling or dramatic crashes. Sometimes they occurred simply because interest faded, momentum stalled, and markets entered long periods of apathy. Before we go on, just a quick reminder, liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and commenting helps this reach more people who care about Bitcoin and macro trends. Appreciate the support.
The price chart for Bitcoin obviously looks like this, and you can see the different market cycles that Bitcoin has had. But one of the things that can be difficult for a lot of people is identifying the lows. Now, we know, if you've been here for a while, right, we know that a lot of the major lows for Bitcoin have occurred near the end of midterm years, or in the case of 2014, 2015, at the very beginning of the pre-halving year or the beginning of the pre-election year. But generally speaking, about every 4 years or so. One of the interesting charts that we can look at, which I think is a great and simple chart for navigating the Bitcoin market cycles, is simply the Bitcoin percentage of supply in profit and loss. So basically, it just shows you what percentage of the supply is being held in profit, what percentage is being held in loss. Now, one of the interesting things is just how cyclical the chart is. We go through periods where the amount in loss trends towards zero because every time we start hitting all-time highs, basically everyone who has bought before then is in profit. And then once we've been up at the extremes for a while, we then tend to come back down. What you'll notice is that this is a great chart for identifying bottoms. It's not necessarily a great chart for identifying tops. One of the reasons for that is because when we are in bull markets and we start setting new highs, we can continue to set new highs for months, if not years. And you can see that this cycle has been no different. But one of the things about Bitcoin is that it does tend to reset in the midterm year. And so, of course, right now, there's all this talk about super cycles and whatnot. And a lot of the reason for that is because a lot of people bought altcoins this cycle instead of Bitcoin, and they feel like the market owes them something, right? They feel that something like that has to eventually happen. Now, ultimately, that is a different topic. But when I just look at the Bitcoin chart, and I'm not cherry picking individual alts because any year, any individual alt can go to a new all-time high. We've already seen that this year with a few altcoins. It always happens. But when you look at Bitcoin through the market cycles, you will notice that the supply in profit and loss, when it converges, tends to occur around the time of the bottom. Now, I'm not suggesting that you need to sit here to try to time it perfectly, but this is a chart we followed throughout 2022, and I think it makes sense to follow it again in 2026. You'll notice that in 2022, once these charts converged, that's ultimately where the bottom was. In 2018, when these charts converged, that is where the bottom was, and the same thing in 2014, 2015. So, and again, also back over here in 2011. So what's interesting is when the chart converges, it tends to be a low. Even in 2020, March of 2020, you can see that when they converged, that was in fact the bottom. Right now, the percentage of Bitcoin supply in profit is about 74.3%, making the supply and loss approximately 25.7%. So essentially 25% of the amount of Bitcoin that people have been buying is currently sitting at a loss from where their entry was. Of course, 74% is sitting in profit. Now, usually where this bottoms, right? Where does it normally bottom? If you look at the percentage of supply in profit, historically it has bottomed somewhere between around, let's call it 36% up to about 45%. So let's just call it somewhere between, say, 35 to 45% has historically been where the Bitcoin percentage of supply in profit bottoms, where more than half the holders are underwater from where they entered Bitcoin. Right now, again, it is 74%. Bitcoin just went down to about 62%. So it's already getting closer to that milestone. But what you'll notice is that when the highs are in, there does tend to be a deeper drop by the percentage of Bitcoin in loss and profit, right? There's a larger drop, and then there's sort of this counter trend rally back up, and then it tends to continue down. You'll notice that oftentimes, with the exception of last cycle in 2021, oftentimes when it gets this low, it does mean the cycle is over. Now, in this case, in 2021, you can see it was a little bit different. Technically, we did go to a new all-time high, but it was somewhat fleeting. And so I think when you look at a chart like this, going into the midterm year, it makes sense to assume that, in my opinion, that this will yield a lower high that will then go into a lower low. And really, when you look at, say, a moving average of these, like a 30-day moving average of the percentage of Bitcoin in supply and loss, you can start to see that behavior that we're talking about. Right? You can see how they kind of converge back to one another. Near cycle lows and near cycle highs, they obviously are further and further apart as Bitcoin goes to all-time highs. It then stays up here. This is not an indicator we talk about a lot in a bull market. And the reason we don't talk about it is because it can stay at the highs for years, right? Like what point is it to say, oh, the supply and profit is 100%? Well, you know that when it's at a new all-time high. And we know that it can stay like that for a long period of time. But once it starts dropping into the midterm year, yeah, I think it makes sense to start looking at these two charts starting to converge back on one another. And just remember, if you're sitting around here, and if later this year, these charts have converged, the supply of profit and loss have converged back towards each other, just like they did at the end of 2022, just like they did at the end of 2018, just like they did at the end of 2014. If you see that happen at the end of 2026, just remember that historically, that will have been a good indicator for getting us close to wherever the market cycle low for Bitcoin is for that particular market cycle.
Midterm years are typically bearish for Bitcoin, but not in a dramatic crash-like way. Instead, they tend to produce slow, grinding price action marked by lower highs, lower lows, and repeated failed rallies. Even when performance looks better than past cycles, momentum usually fades, patience is tested, and markets reset quietly, setting the foundation for the next major expansion rather than immediate new highs.
So Bitcoin this past week essentially rallied up to the 21-week EMA. I don't know if it technically got it. Maybe it did on some exchanges and not on others, but you can see that it got basically there. So we've talked a lot about how Bitcoin would rally to the bull market support band in 2026, right? And I mentioned back, in earlier Q4, not to expect this rally back up until 2026. You can see that we had a similar rally here in 2022. We also had a similar rally in 2018. Now, obviously, I more so compare what we're seeing with 2019. You can also see we had similar rallies up there. We did break above it at one point. So I don't want you to think like it's impossible for something like that to happen. But I do think, for the most part, like the odds are in our favor of heading back down here. Right? Like the odds are in the favor, in my opinion, of ultimately heading back down, mainly not because there's like a lot of people panic selling, but mostly because we basically are just kind of topping, as we said, like we've topped on apathy, and And I feel like when you top on apathy, you're not having like retail panic selling, but there's just a lack of interest in crypto. And so because midterm years in general tend to be bearish, like I'm not saying they have to be following the prior midterm years. In fact, if you were to look at like the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in 2026 and then compare it to say like 2022 and 2018 and 2014, it's doing better than, you know, a lot of those prior years. If you were to add the average of prior midterm years, Bitcoin is actually doing better. Now, if you look at the ROI from the peak, you can see that also Bitcoin is doing better this cycle than the last several as a function of time. I think it makes more sense to compare to that 2019 where it was just slightly lower lows and slightly lower highs. And so if we do get slightly lower highs and slightly lower lows going into the summer months, and we just kind of go down a little bit, it would seem likely that Bitcoin does eventually end up testing this support level down here at around $73,000, $74,000. Like, I mean, I could be wrong, absolutely, but I do think that will likely come into play sometime in the coming months. And, you know, I mean, obviously the big question is, well, can Bitcoin rally up to the 50-week moving average before that happens? Yeah, like, I mean, obviously anything is possible. And a lot of times Bitcoin does rally up to the 50-week moving average, right? You can see it did do that in 2022, and it did do that in 2018. It didn't quite make it there in 2014, but it is something that, you know, that could theoretically happen. So I do think in general, what's likely going to happen is that Bitcoin will form a macro lower high. It will then lead into a drop to the prior support level. And I think there'll be a bounce there. That doesn't mean the current counter trend rally is over, right? Like, I don't know exactly when it's going to end. I just think that a lot of times when you get these 3-month drops, you're likely going to get counter trend rallies that last a month or two, right? So if you look at monthly returns for Bitcoin, you'll see that we just had 3 red months in a row, and then the current month is currently green. In 2021, right? 3 red months, 2 green, and then more red. 2019, 3 red, 1 green, and then more red. So there are times, right, where you get these like 3 red months in a row, and a lot of times it just means the current sellers are exhausted. It leads to some new buyers for a little while, but if the buyers are not able to reclaim some of these prior levels, closer to $110,000, it just seems likely that it will form more of like a macro lower high and then head lower kind of into the summer. And then also remember that a lot of times in the midterm years, sometimes maybe a little bit later, but a lot of times in the midterm years, Bitcoin likes to check in with its 200-week moving average, right? So you first go to the 50, then the 100, then the 2, the 50, the 100, then the 2. This is 2014 and then 2018, and then you have 2022, the 50, 100, and then go below the 2. We've already done the 50. We're now trying to stay above the 100. If it ultimately fails, I think you watch Bitcoin potentially go into that 200-week moving average. Now, the good news is that 200-week moving average is still generally trending higher. Okay, so it will continue to trend up. The 200-week moving average by the summertime will probably be around 64K or so. You know, it'll continue to climb. So just keep that in mind. All in all, you know, I do feel like it feels similar. Like the only main difference in terms of feeling is the way we topped. Like I think we topped more on apathy rather than euphoria. Like there's not a lot of retail panic selling, but just because you don't have retail FOMOing in does not mean you can't have a bear market, right? Like we didn't have retail FOMOing in at the 2019 top, and then Bitcoin still went down for a little while before recovering to new highs. So that's kind of where I think we are. Like I think we're in this phase right now, and then, you know, hopefully sort of the next sort of expansion phase will come later. I just don't really think that expansion phase to durable new highs is going to happen this year. Okay, you know, could it sweep a high? I'm not going to say it can't, but you know, if you look at things like the RSI on Bitcoin, it's already just been putting in lower highs since March of 2024. And you could argue recently this move by Bitcoin on the weekly has just been maybe back testing where the RSI ultimately broke down from. We've seen this happen before. We also saw some similar stuff happen in prior bear markets. So just keep that in mind. I know this isn't necessarily what people want to hear, but again, I don't control the markets. This is what I think is going to happen. I could be wrong, but just based on what I see in the markets, this is what I think is the most likely outcome.
Benjamin Cowen's core message is simple. The market is still in a reset phase. While While short-term rallies can happen, the broader data suggests Bitcoin has not yet entered a sustained expansion. Rather than chasing predictions or timing the exact bottom, the focus should be on patience, respecting market structure, and understanding that major bull runs usually begin after these slow, frustrating periods, not during them.